Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the bullets in the American Civil War. Now, I did a recording here before about sterilization, and I was talking about how some bandages made a big difference because they were sterilized, not because they wanted to sterilize them, it was just by chance. One has to think about all the wounds that took place during the Civil War, and when you try to understand the wounds, I think the best way to do so is to look at some of the bullets. Now, this isn't all kinds of bullets from the Civil War, it's just a handful, just to show you a few things. Like this. This is from a pistol. This is a bullet for a pistol. Look at the size of it. It's pretty big. It's also quite heavy. And, when these things would come at you, they would really do quite a bit of damage. But let's look as we get to bigger ones. Look at these two examples. They're pretty similar, not exactly, but they're big, they're thick, they're heavy, and of course, could do an awful lot of damage. Another one here, look at the size of this bullet. It's huge. Look in comparison, if I can, with my finger. It's the width of my finger, and look at the length. I mean, it's basically one digit of my finger there. It's huge. This thing weighs an incredible amount. I can't convey that to you, but it is quite heavy. Now, these bullets did not fly like this. They would tumble. They would tumble most often when they flew through the air, therefore inflicting incredible damage. If one of these things hit you in the right area, of course, it would kill you instantly. If it hit you in your torso, it was over. These bullet this size is going to rip a massive wound that would be basically unfixable. It would be internal damage of epic proportion. Another thing to think of course, as well, is in the days of the Civil War, surgeons were cutting wounds off of bodies, and anyone who had a wound in an arm or a leg, that would be severed. Now, a surgeon in those days is a very different thing. It's not like we think of surgery today. It was almost like a production line. You have to think of the massive numbers of people killed in the Civil War, which today we figure is close to 700,000 people. Think of how many wounded there are. There were millions of people wounded. And if you were one of the people wounded, let's say in an arm and a leg, there was a production line of surgeons. And a surgeon in those days was a guy who was basically a lumberjack in many respects, because what they had to do is basically saw off the arm or the leg as quickly as possible. A great surgeon was one that could do it quickly, because you have to remember, if you got hit with a bullet or whatever it may be, that there was no antibiotics. There was nothing much you could do except sever where the wound was. That was the only way to save a body, only way to save a life. And it worked relatively well, I imagine. They had pretty good success with it, although many people died from shock. Got to think about it. When you would get a limb sawed off, just think of the horror of that, first off. There was no painkillers. There was no way to dull the pain. The only thing that they would do is put a stick in your teeth and give you a couple of belts of whiskey. And believe me, that didn't make much difference. Now think about Picketts Charge during the Battle of Gettysburg, which was a bloodbath from July 1st to July 3rd. And a horrendous amount of people killed. I mean, basically, in those three battles of those days, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, it equaled out to all the people lost in Vietnam over a course of 14 years. And one of the most horrendous parts of the Battle of Gettysburg, of course, was Picketts Charge, which is the last Napoleonic march, you might say. And so tens of thousands of Confederates were marching across an open field toward the Union battery, of which there were a large number of cannon that were double charged with mini balls. And what mini balls were? It was a cluster of balls this big put together, let's say 20 of them perhaps. And when the guns were fired, they would all separate and go flying. You had like 20, 25 guns loaded, aimed at the people marching. And when they came within a very close distance to those guns, they were fired. The effect was devastating. There was nothing left but smoking shoes. It was frightening. It just cleared away all the humanity. It's horrendous. These are amazing weapons. All of these are. All of them are frightful weapons that were developed for war. And it's hard to imagine the Civil War, and a lot of times here we are celebrating, it's a poor word to use, celebrating, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And these are some of the instruments and proponents of death and mayhem that were used. It's always good to see what caused those wounds, because a lot of times we think of things in a more modern sense. We think of a bullet looking a certain way. And you can see here that these looked very, very different and gave very different wounds. And sadly, the only thing that would save you was a surgeon with a saw. As horrendous as it sounds, that's all there was.